First draft, more like first daft. Usually, the first draft of a novel that people write is the first draft, and the process of writing that draft can be difficult, with plenty of mistakes to be made along the way. Today, I want to help you avoid some of those common first draft mistakes, starting with going back and editing before the draft is done. It's usually assumed that when you write a first draft, you start at the beginning and write all the way to the end without going back to change anything that you've written. This is very good practice for most people, especially beginners. It is very easy to get stuck in a never-ending loop of revising the first third of your novel, while the last 2/3 of your novel never end up getting written. Sometimes assessing where a story needs to improve can only happen once the whole thing is written, and you're always going to have stuff that you need to go back and change, so there's really no disadvantage to waiting until you get to your second draft. What you risk happening here is if the middle of your novel is turning out to be a little bit boring to write, you may be tempted to go back and work on the earlier scenes which are more interesting. So essentially what you end up doing is just avoiding working on the difficult parts of your novel, never finishing it, and ending up with the first quarter of a novel that is really nicely polished. Now, there's a caveat here where for some writers, editing as they go is a part of their process and it helps them write better. But you have to assess whether this is legitimately a better process for you or if it's just a way to avoid doing work. Just because the process feels better doesn't mean it is better. There's a difference between something being a legitimate part of your process and something that you do because you feel bad about how the draft is progressing. Those are two very different things. If you've determined that editing as you go works for you, then that's great. For a lot of people, it's much better to write the draft all the way through, especially if you're a beginner. Next up, second draft mistake number 1. No, wait. First draft mistake number 2, that's right. Trying to make the draft too perfect or not making it perfect enough. First drafts have a reputation for having a bad reputation, which makes sense. The first time through a story is bound to have some warts and unresolved problems. All that being said, excusing problems that you know are problems in your first draft can cause a lot of problems. I should really edit that sentence. There is a small minority of writers out there who reject this multi-draft idea and say that you should work to make your first draft final from the outset. And while there's kind of a legitimate point there, there's a reason that most people don't do that. Novels take time to develop. Sometimes you can't know what needs to happen early on until you've written the ending. Sometimes it's hard to get all the description and character voice and things on the page as you're writing your first draft. It's just too much to hold in your mind as you're writing. Sometimes you just plain don't know how to solve a particular problem, so you need to go back and revise in later drafts. The folks who feel that your first draft should be perfect from the outset are probably not working with the most efficient process, but they do have a point. There's a difference between agonizing over issues that are probably best fixed in subsequent drafts and being lazy, letting stuff slip and justifying it by saying, well, Hemingway compares a first draft to what comes out the business end of a cow, so it's fine to leave this crap in here. A first draft will never be perfect, but it still should be a good effort. You should do the best that you can given the circumstances that usually surround a first draft. You aren't saving any time and you aren't improving your novel by pushing issues down the road. Yes, a first draft is going to have problems, but you can't use that as an excuse to leave things in it that you know are problems that could be fixed if you put a little bit more effort into your first draft. Next up, first draft mistake number 3, not having a plan as you work through the story. Before all you pantsers get your panties in a bunch, hear me out. If you're a plotter, someone who builds an outline of your novel before you draft, then obviously you are going to have a plan before you begin writing. The detail level of that plan might vary between writers, but you're going to have a general idea of where the story is going. Pantsers, on the other hand, go in and do whatever. They figure it out as they move through the thing, the draft. They don't have a plan for where they're going. They just kind of see where things take them. Kind of like me with the last paragraph of the video. Regardless of the style you use, thinking ahead as you write is very important. This doesn't have to be at the level of an entire novel, but at least at a scene or chapter level, you should be thinking about what's happening. Really, when you boil it right down, the difference in process between a pantser and a plotter is just the scale of planning ahead that they're doing. A plotter plans ahead for the entire novel, generally. A pantser tends to work more at a scene-by-scene level. Even if you work off an outline, having a sort of running set of notes about the next few scenes or what is being set up as you work through your draft can work really well. Next up, first draft mistake number 4, skipping over scenes or leaving them out. Admit it, you've had these sorts of thoughts before. Billy and Janet need to have a heart-to-heart conversation in this scene, but I don't really know what they're going to say, and they're talking in the kitchen, and I still haven't figured out what the tile on the backsplash looks like, so I'm just gonna write like a summary of this scene and move on to the scene that I actually want to write. This is just an extreme case of pushing problems down the road. If you don't know how to approach a scene, the only way you're going to figure it out is to write it. Skipping stuff when it gets hard is a very bad habit to develop. I did this a lot when I was working through my first novels, and it did me no favors. You can't avoid the parts of your story that aren't working. You have to make them work, and the only way to do that is to work on them. Your first draft should be completed from the beginning to the end without skipping any scenes that you know you need to have. Yes, it's possible in your second draft you may have to go in and add scenes here or there to flesh stuff out, but the first time through you should not knowingly skip any scenes. That's just pushing the can down the road. And lastly, first draft mistake number 5, not finishing it. Doing the right thing often feels bad. Sometimes a draft feels great all the way through, but more often than not, at some point you're gonna run into a lot of problems. When you reach this stage, it can be tempting to throw in the towel, to say that the story just doesn't work or that you don't have the skill to bring your vision to life. This is where a lot of people start over. They begin a new novel, but often find themselves in the same spot, potentially even at the same point through that new draft. Nothing screws people over more than mistaking the pain and effort required to make something good with a sign that they are creating something bad. Doing the right thing often feels bad. Doing the wrong thing often feels good and easy. Learning often means hurting. The right path is usually uphill. Potential is something that's hard to assess when you're in the valley of despair, staring up at a monstrous hill rising before you that you need to surmount. Pushing through, finishing the draft is almost always better. Even if what you produce turns out to be bad, you will learn more from persisting than you will from giving up and starting over. For most writers out there, especially beginner writers, you should not be fearful of writing a bad novel. You should be fearful of not finishing a novel. Your goal at this stage should be to become a writer who can finish projects, not to become a writer who can write great projects. Finish your draft. If nothing else, finish your draft. Get to the end. Even if you don't have a story worth telling at the end, you'll have a story worth telling about writing a story that wasn't worth telling. And the skills you learn along the way will make your next story even better. Speaking of skills we learned along the way, I hope along the way of this video you learned some stuff. Anyway, this is the outro to the video. So there you have it. I'd love to hear your thoughts about anything we talked about today in the comments down below. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time.